density done well in inner and middle ring is key to the solution to unlocking housing to be able to tackle the crisis that we're ultimately in.
Something that I can think of that is a huge benefit to the new builds industry is helping to solve our housing crisis.
There is a really broad range of buying new properties that will fit a big swathe of different buyers.
Buying a home is huge. The finance, the emotion, the time investment, the paperwork, and sometimes the delays. But in a significant shift, almost 1 in 3 Aussies are choosing to ditch existing homes and build a new one. Joining me to unpack the data and examine just how big the new builds industry is becoming is Senior Economist at PropTrack Paul Ryan and CEO of Development at Mirvac Stuart Penklis. Thanks both so much for coming on the show. It's a super interesting topic as we've seen a huge shift towards buyers opting for new builds. Paul, I'm really surprised that almost a third of buyers are buying brand new. Can you break that down for us in terms of the numbers? Like how many property transactions were there as a whole last year and how many of them were new builds?
Yeah, I think this is a stat that surprises everyone when you tell them. Roughly speaking, we see around 500 to 600,000 homes transact in any given year. Last year, we had 515,000 homes, according to the ABS data. But we finished building, completed construction on 170,000 homes in 2023. So putting those together, that means that 33% or 1 in 3 homes that turned over or transacted in 2023 were newly constructed.
How does that compare historically? Because that's a fair chunk.
It is. New construction's always been a big part of the Australian housing market, and both construction and broader market turnover bounces around a bit. But it's not unusual to see numbers like that, things around a third of new homes, a third of transactions being new homes. If we go back and look over a longer period, over the past decade, we built close to 2 million homes, and there's only just a bit more than 10 million homes across all of the country. So 1 in 5 homes that you see around Australia wasn't here 10 years ago.
That's amazing. But when we're talking about new homes, what are we actually speaking about? House and land, apartments, townhouses?
Yeah, exactly. There are actually quite different markets that make up new housing construction. So house and land is the biggest one, and that's in 2023 was about 2/3 of new construction was houses. But then within houses, you've got a big broad spectrum. You've got from volume builders that build whole suburbs to bespoke construction where people will buy their own land and engage their own architects and builders. Then on the other end of the spectrum, you've got townhouses that can take, that can be anywhere from 2 or 3 townhouses to a big group of 60 townhouses in a development, to apartment buildings, which again can be somewhere between 5 apartments to 250 apartments in a building or even a series of buildings. So there is a really broad range of buying new properties that will fit a big swathe of different buyers.
Why is the number growing? Like, what is fueling the desire for buyers to build new?
Fundamentally, Australia is a growing country. We have high population growth compared with our international peers. And that's the key thing that's driving the need for more homes. The other big thing we've seen over the longer period has been as Australians get richer, housing is one thing that economists call superior goods. And that means that as you get more and more money, you spend more and more of your income on housing because it's something that people value so much. If you look back, say, a generation on how much of people's income they spend on food, it's a much higher share. People are spending less of their income on food as they get wealthier and more of their income on things like luxury goods, but housing in particular is one of those things that people demand. And the way that shows up is that people want more house per person. So the average number of people who live in a house has fallen, and part of that is demographics, but part of it is that people value their own space.
Stuart, I think that all of this shows that there is a real mindset shift amongst the population towards buying new, because it hasn't always been favourable historically. Do you think the new homes market is underestimated? Because what our research shows is that actually only 11% of people, when they start out looking to buy, consider a new home. When it comes time to transact, that number has obviously increased dramatically. And the average time it takes for a buyer in the new home space to research, investigate, search, it's between 12 months for apartments and 16 months for a house and land, with existing homes still in the mix throughout that. Are there benefits to considering a new home kind of earlier in that exploration phase? Could people save their time and their money?
There's a lot of things at play here, and I think it's quite interesting when you look at, for example, what we do as Mirvac, we develop across that full spectrum. So we develop from house and land on urban edge to middle ring development in townhomes through to high-rise apartments. And we've certainly seen, particularly in the last 5 to 10 years, some real trends and changes in the buyer types and I suppose the drivers behind some of those decisions that are made. So, for example, we've certainly seen in inner locations buyers looking to remain in these locations. Historically, we saw a lot of our purchasers would live in an apartment in an inner city location and then look to move further out to more detached housing, as their families grew. But that trend has certainly changed. I'm not saying people still don't move out to bigger homes, but we've certainly seen demand for larger apartments, for example. And I think affordability is a big piece of that. I think historically there was a view that living in an apartment, for example, may have been a compromise in the sense that it might have been tighter from space, storage. But the larger apartments that we're designing now and delivering are really catering to those growing families, people wanting more space. And ultimately, as cities get more and more mature through public transport, social and physical infrastructure, they are certainly pulling people back into inner city locations, which ultimately I think is resulting in, higher quality living in inner city locations. People are definitely being pulled away from private motor vehicle ownership and leveraging, the attractiveness of inner city locations. So there's a lot of factors at play, but ultimately I think as an industry, as we design and develop more and more innovative product, it is certainly becoming a more compelling proposition compared to older style homes.
And so what are those benefits to considering a new home earlier on in that exploration phase?
I think that, affordability has been a big driver. There's no question about it. I think historically people would look at, the established housing market and say, I'm aspiring to buy a detached home. But when you start to look at new off-the-plan apartments and townhomes and even new designs on urban edge house and land packages, the thoughtfulness of design, the quality of design, the way in which new designs have evolved to cater for the way in which people live today, work from home, people are finding that quite a compelling proposition compared to old.
What do you find buyers are looking for with a new build?
Oh, look, without question, the livability of the spaces. And, for example, if it's in the apartments segment of our business, it's certainly the functionality of apartment. It's making sure that every square metre of that apartment is working really hard to improve the amenity of living in that space. Mm-hmm. But it also goes to the amenity within the building.
We see that a lot, things like having EV chargers, for example.
It's from EV chargers to the amenity at the ground plane, being able to walk out of your building and buy a cup of coffee. It's to the gyms, the fitness centres, the co-working spaces that we're delivering in a lot of our buildings now. We're creating communities within a community. And I think that some of that is really compelling to people looking at, buying a new home compared to what you can get in maybe some of the older style buildings.
What's the breakdown of houses, townhomes and apartments?
So I think that's the really interesting part of the market. In the past year, about 2/3 of new housing construction was houses, but that's not always the case. What we have been seeing is that across the country, throughout the cycle, really we tend to build about 110,000 houses every year. And pretty consistently. But what has changed is how many townhouses and units are built. So over the past year, relatively few. But if we go back 5 to 10 years, it was almost as many townhouses and apartments being constructed as there were houses. The fact that those higher density types of construction are quite volatile reflects the challenges that those markets have. Financing conditions and buyer sentiment seems to impact those projects a lot, partly because they take so long to build. And so at the moment where we see relatively slower rates of construction across the country, it's really those higher density townhouses and apartments that are really the ones that are lagging. Houses we seem to keep building a lot of them every year.
Where in the country are the most new builds? I mean, Stuart touched on it before and how there might be the perception that all of these new builds are in those outer ring suburbs. But in reality, like many knockdown rebuild projects are replacing the older, rundown, more established homes.
In the past, I think a lot of housing construction has been those peripheral suburbs, new suburb builds, and that's still a big feature of the Australian housing market. This isn't changing overnight. But what it is shifting towards, and if we look at the plans that all the major cities have drawn up in terms of where they are planning to build homes over the next decade, it all tends to be urban infill. So I think we're not going to stop building detached houses on the edges of cities, but we have been doing that for decades and decades, and it gets harder and harder to push cities further outwards. So increasingly, the focus is going to be urban renewal with townhouses and apartments around transport hubs in particular.
Something that I can think of that is a huge benefit to the new builds industry is helping to solve our housing crisis. We have a huge shortage of stock, and Paul touched on it before about we do have a really high migration. It puts pressure on an already undersupply. So Stuart, do you think that new homes are part of the solution to solving the housing crisis?
Absolutely. And I think we need to deliver housing across that full continuum from inner, middle and outer. And as Paul said, historically the focus has been on the urban edge. That is still part of the solution. But over the last 5 to 10 years, there's been significant investment by government in infrastructure and leveraging that infrastructure now and building greater densities, density done well in inner and middle ring is key to the solution to unlocking housing to be able to tackle the crisis that we're ultimately in.
Yeah, it's almost like, in total opposition to the NIMBY movement, it's the YIMBY movement, the yes in my backyard, the younger cohort of people who are in their 20s, 30s, early 40s who are saying, you know what, I'll compromise and have less space to be closer to the lifestyle that I desire and to the amenities that I want. But what do you think about the government's target of 1.2 million new homes in the next 5 years? Do you actually think that is realistic?
It's a big number, but the fantastic thing is we have a number now. Because a few years back we didn't have a number, and in fact, in many instances, there wasn't an acknowledgement that we've got a housing crisis. So the fact that we've got a target is fantastic. The fact that we now have a federal government who is leaning into housing supply is a big step forward. And ultimately, what we need to see is federal government leaning in, state governments leaning in, and ultimately supporting local governments with infrastructure, supporting local governments with funding to ultimately deliver better outcomes for communities. And there's a big job for industry to do, the property industry to do, to deliver better outcomes for new communities, but also for existing communities. And the delivery of infrastructure is a big piece to helping existing communities deal with change in their community.
Okay, so what sort of projects then does Mirvac have in the pipeline at the moment? Are you kind of leaning into that high density apartment townhomes, or are you still focusing on that outer ring kind of detached home?
Look, it really depends on where we are around the country at the moment. It's fair to say that affordability's really been challenged in the first home buyer segment of the market. So we're still seeing really strong demand for detached housing in Western Australia and Queensland at the moment. Again, affordability is a big piece of that equation there. In Victoria and New South Wales, first home buyers are probably really challenged by affordability. So we're seeing probably less house and land on the urban edge at the moment. We're responding to that with more attached terrace type product in those markets to cater for or to assist with the affordability and the challenges around affordability at that price point. But we're certainly very focused at the moment around that middle ring and inner ring, particularly, as Paul said, the drop-off in commencements in built form apartments has really been significant. It's harder for smaller developers to get projects started. So we see that as a huge opportunity moving forward for Mirvac. And we've been commencing a number of projects in recent months as a result of that shortage of supply, particularly as we see demand from upgraders and demand from downsizers really start to resonate with getting out of their existing home. Either it's too small or it's too big, and gravitating to more of a purpose tailored designed apartment or townhome.
Then what's your buyer demand like?
In recent months, we've seen very healthy demand in that inner and middle ring. But again, it's been dominated by the upgraders and downsizers. And we've seen softer demand in first home buyers just due to the sheer affordability and the challenges around the number of interest rate rises we've had over the last 18 months.
Okay, well, that's still pretty strong from some buyer groups then. But Paul, do you think it's likely that 31% of new builds is only just going to increase in the coming years?
We've had a pretty strong past 12 months or so for housing turnover. But going forward, I think there have been a lot of constraints on the building industry, and they are starting to alleviate now. So yeah, it's looking like housing construction will kind of pick up from here, and is likely to continue to be that big share of housing transactions that we have seen. A lot of Stuart's points were really relevant to easing the housing crisis. I think it's not just people building new homes, but it's innovations on the livability of homes and how people use homes. Things like multi-generational living and designs that mean that we can use the homes we built in a much more efficient way. Things like layouts that can adapt to as people's circumstances and life structures change as they age. These are all things that mean that we do fundamentally need to build a lot more homes, but the more intelligence we put into how we build these homes, the better we can have outcomes for Australians.
And Stuart, what would you say to buyers who have previously been hesitant to consider building new?
There's been a significant maturity in the market, availability of information. People are a lot more researched than they've ever been in terms of
majorly informed audience.
In any of our projects, when we launch a project now, particularly off the plan sales, the amount of research our purchasers have done is incredible. And, we encourage it, but, they thoroughly research the plans. They research all the council applications. They go and visit past projects to see, how our projects stand the test of time. In New South Wales, they've introduced an iCert rating system to rate builders, which has been introduced by the New South Wales government, the Building Commissioner, which we think, again, is another safety net for purchasers to be able to have comfort to buying off the plan and I suppose benefit from what are some of the attributes that you can really gain from buying off the plan and buying something that's been, designed for today's living.
You've both touched on such interesting points, and I think you've given people a lot to think about. But thanks so much for joining me. The new build sector is certainly one to keep our eyes on. I really appreciate both your time.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for joining me. This has been Real Talk. For your weekly fix, please follow wherever you listen to your podcasts and tune in next time for more real questions, news and insights on the topics that matter most from realestate.com.au, Australia's #1 address in property. All information provided is general advice and opinion based on current market conditions. These opinions should not be treated as investment advice. Always obtain advice based on your individual circumstances.
Real Talk acknowledges the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea, air and community. We pay our respects to elders past and present.